7. American Flannel. In late 2017, James McKinnon received a call from Bayard Winthrop, asking for his help and advice on the Flannel project. James knew Bayard a little. He'd met him a few times and once heard him give a fiery speech at an industry conference about reviving American manufacturing. The speech had impressed James, because showing grand ambition was uncommon among textile and apparel people. Like beaten dogs, domestic manufacturers kept their heads down, simply hoping to survive another day. At 50, James was a year older than Bayard. Like him, he came from an upscale suburb within commuting distance of New York City, in his case, Scarsdale. James had also distinguished himself in the beleaguered industry as a beacon of possibility and a risk-taker. He's a guy that's willing to figure out how to dance between the raindrops, Phil Getz, a former business partner, said of him. But where Bayard was a startup founder, James managed a multi-generational textile company, with 6 divisions and an office in a high-rise building in Midtown Manhattan. When Bayard was building his first supply chains, James was already a delegate to the National Cotton Council, a schmoozer who knew every major player left in the game. In the mid-1950s, James's paternal grandfather, Malcolm McKinnon, was one of the founders of Cotswold Industries, a textile converter. A converter purchased fabric from various mills and had it sent to finishing plants to be produced to spec for customers, overseeing the process as a kind of middleman. For years, Cotswold had supplied the headliners and seat covers for Ford. It sold inner lining cloth to the Endicott Johnson Shoe Company, which in the mid-20th century produced 50 million pairs of shoes a year. Made in America textiles went into other Made in America goods. Malcolm's 2 sons, Floyd, known as Wink, and Jim, joined the family firm, and in the 1970s and 80s, they moved into the lucrative business of pocketing, supplying denim makers like Wrangler and Levi's with pocket lining. Wink McKinnon's oldest son seemed positioned to strike out for success in a different direction, the new digital economy. In the early 1990s, James and a friend co-founded an executive recruiting firm that specialized in placing talent with Mozilla and other fledgling internet companies. But, as with Bayard, it was manufacturing actual products that called to him. When a partner died suddenly, the opportunity arose for James to join Cotswold. He jumped at it. Working with my father and working for the family business, I felt I couldn't pass up, he reflected. There are certain connections you have with a parent, hopefully. That was ours. James joined Cotswold in 1994, the year NAFTA became law. The trade treaty was sold by lawmakers on both sides as a win for the American people, a symbolic embrace of global free trade that would lead to hundreds of thousands of onshore jobs and lower prices for consumers. The detractors were few and far between. While running for president 2 years earlier, Ross Perot was ridiculed when he forewarned of the great sucking sound Americans would hear when U.S. companies relocated across the Mexican border. Perot proved to be right, and the textile and apparel industry, true to its nature and history, led the charge in seeking cheaper labor. James followed the needle, as textile people say. His first few years in the business, he traveled to Mexico and other Latin American countries, establishing contacts with local manufacturers. The pocketing business was in a mad rush to get there, he said. It was the Wild West of opportunity. By the end of the decade, big apparel was on the move again, to even lower-cost countries, Bangladesh, Vietnam, India, Sri Lanka, and especially China. It didn't take a PhD in economics to understand that if Levi's 501s or Gap chinos were made in overseas factories, the pocket lining would be, too. James racked up frequent flyer miles trying to secure relationships with factory owners in those markets so that Cotswold wouldn't lose its biggest clients. He made his first trip to China in 1997. He was met at the crumbling old Shanghai airport by a Western facilitator, a German named Reinhardt, and taken to a denim mill in the city. We arrived at this place, and I literally told him, I don't think I can go in that building because I might die, James recalled. It was held up with bamboo sticks. The floor was dirt. The Chinese, at that time, chain smoked. I'm in this factory. I was absolutely frightened out of my mind that the place would either collapse or go up in a blazing fire at any moment. I was tugging at Reinhardt's coat. I think we've seen enough. Let's get out of here. The worst part was they were pouring the indigo chemicals into the river. Less than 2 years later, however, Cotswold was operating a sales office in Hong Kong and manufacturing in mainland China. Pocketing was a basic commodity product, meaning that no company had an advantage over another in making it. Cotswold was competing purely on price. The surest way to keep the family business going for another generation was to follow the herd and outsource production. You were either doing that, James said, or going down. Still, the McKinnons remained committed to American manufacturing. Cotswold owned a weaving mill in South Carolina, Central Textiles. The McKinnons discovered that you could manufacture in the U.S. profitably if you made technical and specialty fabrics. They diversified into any niche market that might generate sales, making the unseen materials that underpin daily life: the stretchy fabric that goes into band-aids, the bias fabric that wraps around the copper cores of telephone cables, the cloth in military ammunition bandoliers, the lining for movie screens. Cotswold supplied blue Oxford fabrics for Catholic school uniforms, flame-resistant toques to culinary workers, and cloth filter bags to gold and silver miners. The company made dress shirts under its own brand, Wingfield, which were sold online. It made fabric wall coverings for Marriott hotel rooms and booties for hospital staff. It was James who dreamed up many of these obscure revenue streams. I did not have any experience in the finance side, nor the manufacturing nor the science side. I told my dad very early on that the only way I would be of use was to go and find markets and try to create rain. James's reputation as a rainmaker had led Bayard to seek him out. Not long after, when James had other business in San Francisco, they arranged to meet at the American Giant offices. There, Bayard repeated to James what he'd been told about flannel, that making it stateside again might be impossible. Unlike everyone else Bayard had asked, James responded, it can be done. You just need the will to do it. In truth, James was bluffing a little. He hadn't seriously looked into the process. But he found himself excited by the possibility. You start to put the pieces together in your head. You think, can we actually do this? When he got back to New York, James gathered his employees together in a room and asked their opinion. Not one of them thought it was still possible to manufacture flannel domestically. James stood up and wrote on a whiteboard all the necessary steps, like he was diagramming a football play: yarn spinning, yarn dyeing, warping, weaving, napping, finishing, sewing the shirts. I said, guys, take a look. This can be done here. This can be done here. He ticked down the list. This can be done here and here. Until finally the team looked at me and said, huh. James and Cotswold agreed to quarterback the flannel project. In practical terms, this meant that James would find the U.S. factories to produce the flannel fabric and that he would oversee the manufacturing journey for Bayard and his team back in San Francisco. Through the winter and spring of 2018, the two men were in daily phone contact, laying the groundwork for the project. Everything, the dyeing, the weaving of the fabric, flowed from the design of the shirt. but the design of the shirt had to take into account the strictures of the rest of the process. Back in San Francisco at American Giant's office, the label's design director, Sharon Harris, began to consider the creative possibilities and, of equal concern to her, the limitations. Like James's, Sharon's career had closely tracked the apparel industry's mass migration offshore. A native of England, she had a degree in fashion design from Kingston University, in southwest London. Her first job, in the late 80s, was designing for the French denim brand Gerbaude, which made its jeans in European mills and factories. In the 90s, she moved to America and worked for the California sportswear company Esprit. At Esprit, practically every single thing was made offshore, in Asia, Sharon told me. As a designer, she came up with concepts, designs, and colors at the brand's San Francisco office, then sent tech packs, the set of directions or blueprints for constructing a garment, to Esprit's office in Hong Kong. Every 6 months, Sharon traveled to Hong Kong to do fittings with models on site and finalize the designs. The clothes were produced in mainland China, Eastern Europe, and India. As time went on, at Esprit and other brands Sharon worked for, design became more and more disconnected from production. She would email tech packs to factories in Asia or Eastern Europe, get samples back 3 months later, and never meet anyone involved in making the clothes. Working from a distance of 5,000 miles, it was impossible to see the clothes in progress and make beneficial tweaks. There was rarely any collaboration between the designer and the head of sewing at the factory. The system was almost entirely cost-driven. You get it at a price that makes everyone happy but the designers, said Sharon. Her last design job before American Giant was at a children's clothing company that manufactured overseas and utilized a product design management system. It's basically data entry, Sharon said. You add a code, like P1604, that's a certain button in black. You literally go in and plug these codes into the system from a catalog of coded components. Sharon liked the company and its culture, but after working there for 2.5 years, I felt so detached, she said. I really was ready to get my hands back on product. See it on the body, fit it, touch it. Designing for American Giant proved to be unlike any job Sharon had had in 3 decades in fashion. A button vendor would visit the label's office, open up a case, and present their wares to her. Face to face, Sharon and the manufacturer could collaborate. You say, instead of shiny, can you make it matte? They're like, yeah, we can make it matte. We'll put it through a tumbler. In 2016, Bayard decided to add denim to the line. Sharon traveled to Georgia to visit Mount Vernon Mills, the 170-year-old cotton mill that had been hired to weave the denim. She looked through racks of sample fabrics with the mill workers. She spent 6 months working with the factory to get the fabric right. Was it strong? Did it have enough stretch? How did it wash? After she settled on the fabric blend, she had the guys at the office back in San Francisco test the jeans for 3 months. From fabrics to trim to sewing, it's all at a human level, Sharon said. Which you don't get working offshore. There's no way you could. The trade-off for this level of hands-on control was having to source all materials in the United States. It was like being the chef at a locavore restaurant located in the desert. Fabrics like merino wool, Oxford cloth, and canvas were scarcely available domestically. Textile innovation now took place in Asia and Europe, which meant that many technical fabrics, like those found in performance outerwear, were impossible to get. At one point, Bayard had looked into adding corduroy to the line, until he discovered that while the weaving, shearing, and finishing could still be done in the US, the cutting of the whales could not. No factory had the machines anymore. Every designer, even very famous ones like Stella McCartney and Tom Ford, faces some technical limitations. But limitations in finding constructive ways around them defined Sharon's job. Many secondary suppliers had moved offshore or gone out of business, leaving just a handful of vendors for zippers, buttons, clasps, and other trimmings. Another example, Sharon loved Riri zippers. Their beautiful metal finishes could change the visual language of a garment, but Riri was a Swiss company, off limits. Instead, American Giant used zippers by YKK, a Japanese firm with a factory in Georgia. Not all American-made labels were as strict. Buck Mason, the direct-to-consumer sportswear brand that was an American Giant competitor, cut and sewed its jeans in Los Angeles, but the denim was Japanese, while the hardware was from China and the dyes from India. Todd Snyder tried to balance his Asian production with made in the USA, finding little pockets of capability that remained, like sweaters, denim and suits. Natalie Channon of Alabama Channon used domestic suppliers whenever possible, and her artisans were local women, but if the most beautiful lace in the world was made in France, that's where she would buy lace. Sharon accepted American Giant's strictures with equanimity, however. She called it a reverse way of working, meaning that you used what you had and were resourceful around that. Labor costs further limited what American Giant could design and sell. I noticed that although it made jeans, the label didn't make a jean jacket. Nor did it offer a popular variation, a Sherpa-line trucker jacket. Nor a 5-pocket, quilted field coat, another staple of American sportswear. Why not? I asked Sharon. Because all the money would go into the sewing, she explained. When there's a lot of stitching needed on the garment, it obviously costs more. Levi's could sell its Sherpa-line jacket, made in Sri Lanka, for around $80. For American Giant to make the same coat and turn a profit, it would have to charge $400, way too much for the mid-priced consumer. Bayard expected to sell the flannel shirt, should he pull it off, for around $115, the upper limit of what he felt was reasonable. Sharon's creative solution was to design clothing that was simple and beautiful and made of great fabric, but without a lot of tricks. No flat felled seams. No adjustable waist tabs with buttons or other adornments that required a lot of stitch work. American Giant's chore coat came unlined, with a single chest pocket. Multiple pockets and a lining were too great an extravagance. You open the fridge in America and make what you can from the ingredients you have in this fridge. Tam Ravenhill, who worked closely with Sharon and the design team to produce the garments, told me matter-of-factly. Now, with flannel, Sharon had to create a beautiful, appealing product from an empty fridge. One afternoon, Sharon went shopping in Haight-Ashbury, searching for inspiration in vintage stores. She picked through piles of old plaids from the golden era of American clothing and bought her favorites, a shirt by Wrangler along with another flannel, made by an obscure workwear brand, that had a good weight to the fabric. The most beautiful in Sharon's eyes were 1970s-era flannels by Pendleton, the Oregon clothier. Made of pure virgin wool, with a hand-loomed look, the shirts were a harmonious merging of factory production and craft. Super fluffy and gorgeous and, you know, brushed and soft and heavier, Sharon gushed. Then the plaid, the actual design, is simpler and not too busy. Back in her design studio, with its mood boards and shelves of sample fabric, Sharon laid out the shirts on a work table for Bayard to inspect. Despite having no design training, he had a close hand in the creation of every garment. Initially, they pretended there were no limitations, they simply responded to what they liked. A vintage flannel with a simple graphic pattern quickly became their favorite inspiration. Sharon scanned the shirt into Photoshop and began creating numerous variations of the plaid pattern. Eventually, reality set in. Someday, if American Giant succeeded in reviving flannel and the supply chain necessary to produce it, they might make a 10-color plaid like that of those gorgeous Pendletons. Something that Neil Young would have worn on a vinyl album cover. But presently, they had to be practical about what the reduced state of American manufacturing could manage, and what American Giant could afford. Baby steps. Sharon, Bayard, and James consulted on the phone. Ultimately, they settled on 6 yarn colors. From this palette, Sharon would design 3 colorways. I want to create an indigo-based one that goes well with denim, she said. I want a black and white one that looks a little Kurt Cobain-y. Then I want a toasty, warm, brown-based pattern that will go with traditional chinos. However, there was an additional constraint put in place by James, intended to minimize costs and not overcomplicate the warping and weaving. Each pattern could feature no more than 4 of the 6 colors. Even that might be too ambitious. What if James came back and said his mill workers couldn't weave Sharon's patterns? We might have to take it down from 4 to 3, she said with acceptance. In May 2018, Bayard and James met for lunch at a chain sandwich shop in Manhattan's Garment District. I joined them at a back table, listening as they went over the battle plan, as Bayard put it. James was a tall, trim man with light brown hair, an impish smile, and heavy-lidded eyes. With a collared dress shirt, crisp jeans, and the kind of fleece vest favored by finance guys, he didn't seem the tatty flannel sort, but, he said, I went to a few more Grateful Dead shows than I care to admit in college. I spent 4 or 5 years touring. It was me and my flannel. You had your khaki shorts, your Birkenstocks, and your flannel. He smiled. And you had to have your shades. Especially when you went home after 3 weeks on the road. At lunch, James spoke to Bayard and me in technical terms about flannel and why dyeing yarn was such a complicated engineering process. Were you concerned about functional machinery? Bayard asked. James shook his head. I knew the machinery was still available. It was the expertise, the artistry. Getting your colors to come out exactly how your designer wants it. Flannel is an art in an art form. One of Cotswold's obscure revenue streams was making yarn-dyed fabrics for uniforms for transit workers. On New York's Metro North and Long Island Railroad lines, the conductors wear a pinstriped shirt, a yarn-dyed, woven shirt. It's not a sportswear product, James said. It's a commercial product that is heavily synthetic. But I knew that I wasn't completely in the dark. This was how tenuous the supply chain was for flannel. A rail worker's uniform had given them hope. James told Bayard that he had lined up a firm to dye the yarn. The workers behind Burlington Manufacturing Services, or BMS, were yarn specialists. James called them the best people I know. Each point along the production chain was a hurdle to overcome, a test to be passed. Failing at any one of those points would sink the project. As tricky as dyeing was, James said he was most concerned about the warping stage, in which the thousands of dyed yarns were loaded onto a beam and prepared for the loom. It's the hardest technical engineering aspect of this entire adventure, he said. And it hasn't been done in 30 years. BMS would be doing the warping as well, James said. When is this happening? Bayard asked. Right now. Literally right now. The pattern is on the warper this morning. Bayard sat up in his seat, caught by surprise. Today? I didn't know that. We could have made a mistake with the yarn, James told Bayard. You're not going to know it until you see it. We'll know if we pass the hurdle of warping by Wednesday next week. Despite the note of caution, James looked upbeat, even confident. Until now, his career in textiles had traced a quarter-century race to the bottom, a competition to see who could make a product the cheapest. It had been one endless scramble to keep the family business going. But since Bayard had called, James had been thinking about more than just survival. Now, for the first time, because of this collaboration, you get up in the morning and you've got a hop to your step, he told me. Let's go make something awesome. I know we can do it again. He looked to Bayard as if to a teammate in the huddle and added, you get tired of always playing defense. Let's play some offense. In June, now just 5 months to the deadline, Bayard traveled to the Carolinas to check up on production. I met him on a rainy weekday morning in the lobby of the Sheraton Raleigh. Although Bayard no longer shopped at Goodwill, his style had not evolved far. He wore the same outfit every time I saw him, American Giant blue jeans and a black cotton American Giant t-shirt. He approached briskly, greeted me with hey, dude, and turned toward the revolving door like we were already late. Never travel with Bayard, his wife had warned me. He doesn't like a wasted minute. Inefficiency drives him crazy. Bayard's first meeting of the 2-day business trip was with BMS, the yarn dyer that James had brought into the project. The firm's plant was in Burlington, North Carolina, an hour east of Raleigh. I drove the rental car while Bayard chatted away in the passenger seat. He was an engaged, intimate conversationalist, speaking in a voice that often sounded hoarse, as if from excessive talking at high volume. 5 minutes into the drive, he revealed to me that he took cold showers each morning. I read an article in the Times about it, Bayard said. The writer basically said, yeah, maybe there are health benefits, but the real benefit is you start the day with something that's hard. It sets you up for a whole day of I gotta get stuff done. The conversation turned, as it often did when Bayard and I were together, to how deindustrialization had hollowed out America's heartland. The subject was appropriate to the setting. In just the 5-year period between 1997 and 2002, North Carolina had lost 170,000 textile and apparel jobs. In 2003, the Kannapolis-based bedding manufacturer Pillowtex closed all 16 of its plants in the US and Canada, creating one of the worst mass layoffs in the state's history. Almost 5,000 men and women were plunged into the abyss of the service economy to work part-time hours with no benefits at a dollar store or to pack boxes in a fulfillment center. Back in the Mission storefront days, Bayard had been reluctant to play up in marketing the fact that American Giant's clothing was all made in the U.S.A, or to talk politics. He believed that where the clothes were produced should be secondary to their quality. And he worried about getting lumped in with the flag wavers and talk radio patriots, about appearing bluntly patriotic, despite the bluntly patriotic name he had given his company. Bayard was no conservative crusader. Yet as Americans everywhere grew angrier and more outspoken about the country's problems, and as Donald Trump brought the debate on trade with China front and center during his presidency, Bayard began to proselytize on behalf of the industry, trying to create not just good clothes but a movement. He met with Washington lawmakers who said they wanted to bring back manufacturing jobs, and when they failed, in his eyes, to follow through, he called them completely full of shit. He wrote editorials chastising not just big apparel but big pharma and big tech, too, for chasing cheap. I was not the first journalist to visit him in North Carolina over the years. He had marched reporters and executives of competing apparel brands through the cotton fields and factories that supplied American Giant to show them that, yes, you could still make clothes here. Bayard's politics and the source of his anger, the force of it, were hard to pin down. His indignation came across as genuine. He'd founded a company committed to U.S. manufacturing, after all. But having never worked in a factory himself, or lived in a factory town, his view of it was romantic and a little blinkered. The American giant office staffers in San Francisco enjoyed free wellness programs and were treated to guest speakers and other perks. It had not occurred to him to do the same for the mill workers at the 2 sewing plants in North Carolina. When he caught himself and tried to correct the oversight, he was at a loss for what the employees of a rural factory might want, suggesting maybe a gym membership. There was an airy, rhetorical quality to his speech that sounded different from ground-up experience. Lately, my thinking around free trade is, he would opine, and go on to list his policy prescriptions, as if he were running for political office. On the drive to Burlington, I heard for the first time what amounted to Bayard's stump speech, which he delivered time and time again to reporters, to elected officials, to industry colleagues, to his employees, to his family members including his eldest brother, Jay, who had followed in the Winthrop family tradition, attending Harvard, living in Greenwich, and running a wealth management firm. Jay had also invested in American Giant. The stump speech blasted companies that made a Faustian bargain to save pennies per garment. It listed the benefits of doing business in the United States, how you could develop working relationships based on a common culture and something more than dollars and cents true partnerships. The speech carried a note of optimism, suggesting a change was in the air. There's no reason a lot of the big brands couldn't return to doing some of their production domestically and have a real impact, Bayard said. And I think, by the way, this is happening. But it also warned of a deepening division in onshore manufacturing, between businesses that have the know-how, the vision, and the courage to invest and stay ahead of the curve, and those that don't. It was raining lightly when we arrived in Burlington, a former textile manufacturing hub of 58,000 people that seemingly had yet to recover from the loss of its main industry. The GPS took us through an empty business district and into a residential neighborhood of small bungalows with peeling paint and weedy yards and not a soul in sight. The area grew more industrial as we crossed a railroad siding and drove past a cement plant surrounded by a chain-link fence. We stopped for a red light at an intersection. On our left was an isolated row of brick storefronts, a bar, a Mexican restaurant, a tax preparer, all dark at midday. On our right, looking huge and eerily still almost mirage-like through the windshield, was a massive textile factory. We turned and drove slowly down a street that ran parallel to the building. It seemed to stretch on for half a mile. At about the halfway point, the facade was set back to accommodate a parking lot, and overlooking the lot were glass windows of what looked like offices. Hardly any cars were in the lot, so we drove right up to the door. A sign CS Industrial Complex, with BMS listed as a tenant, confirmed this was the right place, but Bayard appeared doubtful. There were no signs of activity, no sounds of industry coming from inside the factory. Bayard stood in the parking lot in the drizzly rain. For once, he wasn't charging forth. I guess this is it, he shrugged before opening the door and going inside. They stood on the dirty carpet in the small lobby, with big smiles and arms extended for handshakes. The brain trust of BMS, Al Blaylock, Bill Singleton, and Ron Ferris. The best people I know, as described by James McKinnon. They ushered Bayard into a windowless room, drop ceiling, fluorescent lights, office furniture of the cheapest kind, and took their seats around a conference table. Welcome to BMS, a division of Decorative Fabrics of America, said Al, who was president of the company. He was short and trim, about 70, with a downturned mouth and a tightly wound manner. Just a little bit about who we are, where we came from, Ron, the company's sales rep, chimed in. Ron had thick steel gray hair and a leisurely, amused way of speaking, as if all of life was a sales call over a barbecue lunch. Yep. Great, said Bayard in a clipped tone. I knew he loathed small talk and sales pitches. Al sorted through some printed materials spread before him on the table. He looked displeased. Our graphic artist could have done better. God damn it, he muttered. He seemed to forget that Bayard was sitting there. Then he caught himself. Okay. Our total company is made up of 4 divisions. He named them, explained what each one did. The company owned an upholstery fabrics plant elsewhere with 3 different businesses in that facility. The 4th division, BMS, dyed yarn in this massive factory. There's a historical marker out front, Al continued. You may have seen it when you came in. This plant you're in, the Pioneer plant, was built in 1923. It's been in operation ever since. It was the first Burlington Industries plant. You don't know Burlington Industries, but when I joined them in 1970-something, they were the largest textile company in the world. At this, Bayard's ears perked up. When were you the largest? He asked. At what point in time? 70s. Even into the 80s, answered Ron, who had also worked for Burlington. 88 is when the crap kind of hit the fan. The story, as the 3 men told it, was a parable of late-stage capitalism. We had a hostile takeover by a private equity corporate vulture, Al said. The corporate raider was Asher Edelman, who was an inspiration for the Greta's Goodfin and Sear Gordon Gecko in the 1987 film Wall Street. During the ADS, many U.S. textile companies made large capital investments to stay competitive in the global market. Burlington, for instance, spent $40 million to replace a turn-of-the-century mill with a brand new plant filled with the latest Japanese-made Nissan looms. The capital expenditures lowered Burlington's net earnings and caused the stock to underperform, in the language of Wall Street. Edelman believed he could squeeze more profit from the company if he owned it. Management refused to sell it to him. The parties got into a bidding war over the stock, sending the price skyward. The battle for Burlington dragged on for months, very publicly, until management succeeded in taking the company private through a leveraged buyout that left it saddled with $2.4 billion in debt. Burlington's first major decision after the LBO was to lay off 500 employees and close the R&D division. In the following years, chunks of the company were sold off to service debt. Plants and divisions were closed and generous employee benefits were stripped back. As the broader industry continued to decline, Burlington cannibalized itself to stay afloat. I mean, we had our own roofing company, our own trucking company, said Ron, who had gone to work for Burlington right out of college, in 1979, when the company had more than 140 plants across 15 divisions and some 80,000 employees worldwide. Totally self-sufficient. And pretty much at that time all domestic. In 2007, Burlington sold off its oldest asset, the Pioneer plant. A retired company executive bought the building and formed BMS to keep the dye house going. Al, who had been a top boss at Burlington, was hired to run the new enterprise. Ron came aboard that same year after his division of Burlington Home Decorative Fabrics, for which he supervised quality control, was sold to a competing firm. As for Bill, a big-bellied man with a deep, phlegmy voice, he had followed his father into the textile mills and worked in one southern plant or another for 45 years. For a span of those years, Bill had managed a dye house for J.P. Stevens, the company whose brutal hostility toward unions had inspired Norma Ray. He had to carry a card in his pocket printed with responses he was to give to any talk of unionizing. We've all lived through the downsizing of textiles, Ron said. That much was apparent. They were rattling around a 650,000 square foot factory practically by themselves, like the last survivors in a disaster film. Nodding to his colleagues around the table, Bill said, "There's probably 120 years of experience right here." Getting back to the presentation, Al rummaged among spools of fabric on a nearby table, found a thickly braided rope, and held it up. "We do this yarn for the military. It's a 46,000 denier polyester. This is propelling rope to go out of a helicopter. You ever see the movie Black Hawk Down?" Bill said to Baird. "That's the ropes the Marines used." Baird grabbed another spool. "What's this?" "It's for a local gentleman who does hunting socks," Ron said. The firm's other accounts included dyeing high-visibility yarn for safety vests, cotton poly material for U.S. Air Force shirting, cording for marching band uniforms, yarn for terry cloth towels sold at the Masters tournament, and parachute attachment lines for a client up in Rhode Island. "You get my drift about doing a lot of different things," Al said. "Let's say you're a specialist in polyester. Well, that doesn't mean squat because you're competing with the world. A company across town had only big dyeing machines and one or two types of products. And they're out of business as of this May." In fact, BMS had not only dyed the yarn for American Giant but also handled the warping, too. The Pioneer plan had that capability. Al riffled through the papers in front of him, coming up with printouts of the 3 patterns that Sharon had designed. He showed Baird the sheets. "This is warp number 1, this is warp number 2, this is warp number 3. A look of alarm flashed across Baird's face. He had entrusted James to oversee the critical warping stage, and James had delegated the job to these 3 doddering fellows and this ancient factory. What had he gotten himself into? "So the beams will go down to Central," Baird reassured himself, referring to Cotswold's mill in South Carolina. "Central will weave it." "That's right," said Ron. "Matter of fact, they're down there now." "Any problems there, Ron?" "No. Actually," Ron said, reclining in his chair, "it went pretty well." Al, Bill, and Ron led Baird on a tour of the plant. One had the sense of entering the bowels of a great ship, the murky light, the subterranean feeling, the distant rumble of heavy machinery. The workrooms had the vast dimensions of airport hangars, one cavernous space flowing into the next. In one of the workrooms, yarn was being prepared for weaving. 8 section beams, huge steel rollers, sat on iron tracks. Each beam had 1,000 ends of white yarn wound around it. A motor was unspooling all the yarn from the 8 section beams and transferring it onto a single, even larger loom beam about 20 feet away. The process was a scene of unexpected beauty, thousands of white yarns, suspended in midair, flowing together as one body, like a fast-moving, translucent river. Al, Ron, and Bill showed Baird into the plant's color lab, a clean, white, brightly lit room walled off from the industrial workspaces. Baird was introduced to Ron McBride, the plant manager, who had supervised the yarn dyeing for American Giant's Flannel. A stocky man with glasses and a dusting of white in his red beard, McBride could also date his career back to the 1970s, when right out of high school he took a job in a color lab in Salisbury, North Carolina. He fell in love with textiles and shade matching then and there, he said, and decided to make it his career. All around the orderly lab were clear glass bottles filled with chemicals marked soda ash 100% or common salt 100%. Dye liquors were kept in plastic bottles on a rolling cart and labeled by color. Chemical formulas for various colors were written out on note cards organized in filing drawers. "What really caught me," McBride said, "was a dyer could look at a shade under a light box and say, 'This isn't quite right. I need to add 5% of yellow and 8% of blue to make this piece of yarn look like it's supposed to look.' I thought it was amazing. It makes you feel good to take something that's not correct and fix it." Al, Bill, and Ron brought Baird out to another workroom behind the color lab that held several dyeing tanks spaced apart on a stained cement floor. Even if you'd never been inside a textile factory, it was obvious that the machines, like so much of the plant, were out of date. "90s vintage," Al said, quickly adding, for Baird's reassurance, "but thick stainless steel and, basically, they never wear out. We do 100,000 pounds a week here on these machines." Baird did not look reassured. The more he had seen of the BMS operation, the more his face had taken on a look of quiet panic. In the car earlier, speaking of the Flannel project but also referring to American Giant more broadly, he had told me, "It's important that we've got people that are planning to be in the fight in 5 or 10 years. BMS had the appearance of a company that might not be around in 5 or 10 weeks. In each enormous room, there were only 1 or 2 workers walking around. Some rooms had no workers, only idle, inert machinery, like some Smithsonian exhibit on mid-20th century manufacturing. The median age of the employees we did encounter was around 60. It created a spectral feeling. I could imagine returning here later to find that everything we had seen had been an apparition, that the plant had really been silent and empty for years, as in a ghost story." In the gloom of the dyeing room, Bill and Ron were kidding around with Baird, pitching and flattering him like a couple of salesmen. "This is music to my ears, for you to come and say you want to make a product totally domestically. That's an awesome feat." Baird ignored the flattery, his face a constellation of worry. "My whole Flannel program rests on these guys." Back in the parking lot after the tour, he looked like someone who'd emerged grimly into the daylight from a funeral home. "That plant and that team," he said as he got back into the car, "is not exuding a lot of innovation and investment and forward thinking." When Baird arrived the next morning at the Central Mill, where the flannel fabric would be woven, James came smiling down the office hall to greet him. Still rattled by his visit to BMS the day before, Baird skipped the pleasantries. "Talk me off the ledge," he said. "Have you been to that facility?" 2 years ago, James said. "Well, maybe you should take another swing through. It just felt like a cavernous space where not much was happening." James laughed. "That's the state of the U.S. textile industry." Cotswold's Central Mill appeared the opposite of the Pioneer plant, alive on this hot summer day with the hum of machinery and the beeping of forklifts moving big bales of yarn. Tractor trailers with their rumbling engines pulled up to the loading dock outside to take finished goods coming out of the mill or drop off raw materials going in. James showed Baird into the wood-paneled office of Bill Steen, the vice president of manufacturing. Steen had been the plant supervisor of the mill when it was owned by Cannon Mills, more than 30 years before. "What was this mill like back then?" Baird asked. "It was what we call an integrated mill," Steen said. "Bales of cotton, bales of polyester coming in one end, and when we shipped it out, it went out as fabric. When this was a Cannon plant, we had 300 employees. Okay. Today, we have roughly 100 on our payroll and we're producing more yards than we were then." The McKinnons had invested in the future and stayed ahead of the curve. The looms they'd inherited when they bought the mill in 1984 were all gone. And the looms they'd replaced them with had since been replaced, too. The electricity bill to operate the plant ran $150,000 a month in summer, Wink McKinnon had told me. But owning a mill gave Cotswold flexibility and control. It could make what it wanted when it wanted, rather than find itself at the whim of foreign factories or geopolitical curveballs. James said to Baird, "You have to be agile to survive in the textile business." Steen held up the mill's production sheet for that week. "Look at that list. It must be 35 products we make here." That week, the week of June 25, 2018, one of those manufactured products was flannel fabric for American Giant. They'd begun weaving it 2 days before. James invited his partner to have a look. As he led Baird from Steen's office out to the factory floor, James had a literal buoyancy about him. His springy walk bordered on a strut. The weaving room lay behind a heavy steel door that slid on a track like the entry to a barn. A sign taped to it read, "Please keep door closed." From the other side came a muffled rumble. James passed out earplugs. Then he gave a yank on the handle, and it was as if he had opened a door onto Niagara Falls. The noise was deafening. It was not a monolithic wall of sound, though. It had discernible, ear-splitting layers, a low bass hum of white noise, a mid-range of motorized grinding, a high register of sharp, fast, tinny stabbing. The noise leaped right inside your body and rattled your nerves after only a few seconds. The source of the cacophony lay before us, 154 high-speed looms, about 10 feet long by 10 feet wide, placed in long rows in a room the length of about 1.5 football fields, frantically jabbing away. "Pickin' all looms. From Belgium." James yelled over the roar. "Fastest today. Those looms cost about $150,000 apiece." On this day, the mill's weaving room was almost entirely dedicated to making Cotswold's bread and butter product, a drab, off-white cloth destined to become curtains in hospitals, pocketing fabrics for jeans, and shirting fabrics for chefs and food service workers. But one loom, number 7, was weaving fabric whose plaid pattern stood out radiantly. James made a U-first motion to Baird, who approached the square, boxy machine eagerly. The rear of the loom held the warp beam, from which dyed yarns were unspooled. The crosswise weft yarns, meanwhile, were fed from spools on a nearby creel. This perimeter area was calm. The actual weaving took place in the machine's violent center. As the lengthwise warp yarns got pulled across the loom's surface, they passed through a wire heddle, which separated each one to allow for insertion of the crosswise wefts. Simultaneously, a reed, which resembled a big metal comb sitting atop the surface, moved up and down, guiding the yarns along. Meanwhile, down inside the machine's heart, a row of thin steel needles darted back and forth. All these actions happened in furious, rapid coordination, and the effect was a kind of chaotic precision. Rolling across loom number 7 was one of Sharon's 3 patterns, the black, white, and navy plaid she'd designed to pair with jeans. James smiled proudly. Baird hopped onto the operator's platform. He leaned over and put his face right down beside the furious needles to examine the woven cloth as it came through the loom. His expression registered first wonder, then approval, then, finally, a huge grin to match James's. The gradients of color in the pattern, the variations in stripe width, the repeating grids, all exactly like Sharon's Photoshop renderings. Every last one of the 3,900 ends of yarn had been laid on the warp beam correctly. And the colors. The navy blue was deep and rich, like the twilight sky, with a uniformity of shade. The old dogs at BMS had come through. I thought back to Bill Singleton's remark about the 100+ years of experience collected in that plant, the talent gathered in that building to dye cloth. I learned later that Ron Ferris had supervised quality control for a division of Burlington that produced 2 million yards of fabric per week. Ron McBride, who himself had run several dye houses over a 40-year career, later told me that he'd been amazed at what the BMS guys could do when he went to work there. With the equipment they had to work with, he said, they produced phenomenal quality out of that plant. Watching flannel cloth roll off the loom in a cascading sheet, Baird couldn't stop grinning. For him and James, it was a shared moment of amazement. They had surprised even themselves. James walked us away to a spot where he could talk without having to yell. "This plaid is the most technical product we have ever put in this mill," he said. "I wanted to challenge our ability. Could we do it?" James confessed that there had been several false starts before Baird's visit. The blue and black weft yarns were so alike in color that James and his team had confused the spools. The first run had to be scrapped. Then they'd programmed the loom to insert the weft yarns in the wrong order. More frustration. So they'd tried a different pattern, but they couldn't get that one correct, either. It was only in the days before Baird's arrival, working again with the black and navy plaid, that they'd finally figured it out. But now that one pattern had been woven successfully, James was sure the hardest part was behind them. "My confidence during this project has gone from 90% down to 40% up to 70, James said. "Now, it's at 95. Baird was still watching the flannel cloth roll across the loom, in open-mouthed awe. "I'm happy for him," James said. "It's his vision." Baird came over to James. Being able to look at the fabric and see that the depth of color and pattern are there to see it come through so well, the color and depth and variation, he was at a rare loss for words. Finally, he heaved a sigh of relief and said, "That's a load off." The summer deepened. To have flannel shirts on sale for Christmas, American Giant had to have finished not just woven fabric ready to be cut and sewn, at the absolute latest, by the end of September. And then James ran into a problem he couldn't solve. It was the napping. In July, Cotswold sent sample fabric to a finishing plant in North Carolina to be brushed and napped, and when it came back, well, it was something less than a cozy flannel. "Let me show you what it looked like after our first pass," James said when I visited him one day at Cotswold's office near Manhattan's Bryant Park. He left the room and came back carrying a 6-foot-wide bolt of the black, white, and navy plaid. Unrolling the fabric across his desk, James invited me to feel it. I ran my hand along the surface. It had the coarse texture of cheap motel curtains, all the softness of outdoor carpet. I remembered what John Bacane, the former Cone Mill CEO, had told me about flannel. How it required technicians, artistes who could expertly set the napping machines, and mechanics who could maintain them. How it was art, not science. James shook his head. Our finishing plant said, "Hey, this is the best we can do." James sent the fabric back to the plant. 5 times. Additional rounds of finishing yielded little improvement. July flew by with no finished shirt, then August, then half of September. Finding it difficult to explain over the phone the pajama feel that he and Baird wanted, James sent the finishing plant detailed written instructions about the procedure. The plant manager told James that if they napped and brushed the fabric the way he wanted them to, it would become too brittle and break apart. What he was asking for, the finisher said, was impossible. James began to freak out. He felt the whole project slipping away. But he could only push the finishing plant so hard. These guys, they were, like, you're talking about finishing 500 yards. We finish 500,000 yards a day. Give me a break. Throughout the ordeal, James was in regular communication with American Giant. At one point, he sent Bayard, Sharon, and Tam a sample of the coarse sample fabric so that they would understand what he was dealing with. By the middle of September, Bayard had lost his patience. He got James on the phone. You're not going to make the deadline, he said. With a heavy heart, James replied, you're right. At Cotswold's headquarters, James went into a post-mortem of everything that had gone wrong. He had hired the finishing plant because it could do every part of the process under one roof. If he moved the fabric around too much, brushing it here, napping it there, press rinking it somewhere else, he worried it would get screwed up. But he admitted his mistakes. We tried to outsmart ourselves. It was a strategic sourcing error. It was a communication error. There were just so many things that went wrong. On the phone with Bayard, James acknowledged they were now very unlikely to make their winter deadline. He apologized and took the blame. We have two options, James said. We can scrap the thing completely and just call it a noble failure. Or we can continue on with the development and punt the whole thing another year. But neither man was quite ready to give up. In late September, in a last-ditch effort, James and Bayard sent a few rolls of fabric to Paige Ashby at Carolina Cotton Works. CCW couldn't handle every process under one roof. That's why James hadn't gone to them first. Still, it had been Paige who had collaborated with Bayard on the hoodie, agreeing to develop the fabric when other mills wouldn't. Without Paige, there would be no American Giant. Could he nap the flannel? Along with Bayard, I visited CCW's Gaffney, South Carolina, finishing plant, where industrial-scale washers and laundry presses vibrated and spewed steam into the air, bleaching and press-rinking fabric before it was made into clothes. The napping machine, by contrast, looked inert and primitive, a large square box with 24 rollers attached to a revolving cylinder. Each roller had little wires, like the bristles on a round hairbrush. Some were hooked and others straight. There were three elements to operating the machine, Paige explained. One was tension, the tightness of the fabric against the wires. The second was speed, how fast to turn each roller. The third was also speed, how fast to set the big cylinder that turned all the rollers. The whole project came down to Paige and CCW's napper operator, 62-year-old Roger Putnam. A textile mill lifer, he had never napped flannel before. As Bayard put it, watching Putnam at work, we succeed or fail on that man's shoulders. Paige, at least, showed no signs of worry. With easy confidence, he explained to me how he planned on making the flannel soft. You have to raise those fibers out of the yarn. Get it to be a little bit fuzzy, if you will. Not make it like a blanket. He smiled. We just want to tickle it a little bit. Later that fall, Paige sent Bayard and James a sample. It had the soft pajama feel of the flannel shirt from Bayard's boyhood, the shirt that had made him feel cool and capable. CCW had tickled the fabric just right. Another finisher, Yates Bleachery in Flintstone, Georgia, came aboard to handle the press rinking. Then it would be on to Jade Apparel, a Philadelphia sewing factory run by a Vietnamese immigrant and her two daughters, for the final step, the sewing of the shirts. Now that Bayard and James had successfully reassembled the entire supply chain, they came up with a new, modified plan. American Giant would do a limited run of a single pattern 2,000 yards of the black, white, and navy plaid, or enough to make 1,200 shirts. BMS, Cotswold, CCW, Yates, Jade all would have to rush production. But American Giant flannel would be available for Christmas, with more to come in the new year. James directed his mill workers at the central plant to focus exclusively on weaving flannel. He called Paige's son Brian and begged and pleaded for CCW to nap the first run of 500 yards, a job that would normally take a month due to the plant's production schedule but that Brian agreed to do in 48 hours. Cotswold had worked with Yates Bleachery for 30 years, and it was because of that relationship that Tim Harris, Yates's general manager, stayed at the plant until 2 a.m. one night to finish the job. James had just received an email from Harris, confirming the final inspection of the fabric when, on the morning of November 7th, I dropped by his office. Yesterday at 1:24. That's when I knew. Mission complete. Freed from the stress of deadlines, forgiven for his earlier failure, James was in an upbeat, philosophical mood. Look at all of the energy and the brainpower and the people throughout North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia that really put their heart and soul into something that hopefully is a piece of art, a piece of beauty, he said. With real emotion in his voice, he concluded, it means something for all of us. Not long after, a package arrived at my apartment in Brooklyn. The return label read, American Giant, San Francisco. Inside was a black, white, and navy flannel shirt. It practically glowed in my hands. The struggle of its creation was inseparable in my mind from the shirt itself, and it hung in my closet for weeks, unworn. I was afraid to wear it, fearful that if I carelessly ripped it or got a food stain on the front, there would never be another one. Woven and made in USA, the neck label said. When Bayard was next in New York for business, we met at a coffee shop. Was it worth it? I asked him. Was it worth all the time, energy, and resources? What I continue to be struck by is this undercurrent in the supply chain of, give us a shot, Bayard said. At this, I thought of the BMS guys, sitting in the Pioneer plant, waiting for someone to come along and hire them so they could dye beautiful cloth. I thought of James, a businessman with energy and ideas in an industry on life support. As if speaking not to me but to the executives and sourcing managers of every onshore apparel brand, Bayard added, there's a bunch of incredibly capable, motivated people here. Before you think this can be done easier or faster or cheaper overseas, remind yourself of that. His eyes flashed. It's worth it for that alone to prove the ability to do it. No text can be read aloud.